So if if you read the internet and
not all of it,
the whole thing. Sometimes I think I do, but the mainstream media element of it, but also some of the sort of independent blogging parts of it as well. It seems to me there's almost like a global move now to divide the world into left and right, and then there are two people in two trenches, and they just throw stuff at each other.
Yeah.
Is that a sort of new political paradigm? It's just my guys against your guys.
Well,
and I mean, is that? Are we actually moving to that kind of design? Do you think?
That's the way I start the essay, because I don't know. Maybe someone here could tell us after the event or when we get to questions from the floor or something. But I don't know what left wing means. I don't know what right wing means either. I know what it used to mean. I mean, it came from the French Revolution. The left wing were the revolutionaries. The right wing were loyal to the regime. Okay, that's probably the most coherent definition of left and right. But unless there are any revolutionaries here, there may be, you're all right wing by that definition, and you may not accept that. And there's a fantastic essay which I quote at the start of this by Andrew Kenny, writing in The Spectator, which is of course a conservative publication, and he begins, and it's the best opening sentence to an essay I've ever read. Is Osama bin Laden left wing or right wing? And then he goes on. What about, I can't remember exactly, but it's like, what about Robert Mugabe? And this sentence is amazing. Who has a more left-wing approach to women's sexuality? Pope John Paul II or Hustler magazine? Really good questions. And he just deconstructs the whole thing. Is it right-wing to love capitalism? Or flip it the other way. Is it left-wing to hate capitalism like Hitler? Is it right-wing to be violent and cruel like Lenin? Is it left-wing to be internationalist like McDonald's or the World Trade Organization? And so on and so forth. Is it right-wing to be racist like the Communist Party of apartheid South Africa that wanted a white workers South Africa?
So how do we actually then interpret the modern domestic political contest then, say, between the Labor Party and the coalition?
We could probably
Kevin Rudd
we could probably call it the Labor Party and the coalition if we had to come up with a label. At least it's accurate. But
do you think there aren't animating ideas on either side?
Well, this is what I'm currently struggling with. Well, because the point that Kenny's making about left and right is because we don't know what these words mean and they've really lost any meaning that they had, what they mean is gangs. My guys and your guys. And we know that we hate you. We may not really know why. We know we hate you. And
sort of a Richmond Carlton match, basically.
A little bit like that, except I know exactly why I hate you.
I've tipped my hand. I'm the other side, by the way.
Yeah. I'll see you on Thursday. Anyway, the point, though, is that ideas have vacated the field here. Teams dominate it, but ideas don't. And so that's why I find it very difficult. Your question, it's a very good question. It's a very hard one to answer. What are the animating ideas of politics now? You could argue that at least the conservative side of politics had adopted an idea in neoliberalism and was acting upon it. But even that's beginning to fray. When I look at Tony Abbott, I don't know how to describe him philosophically. People say he's a very, very conservative leader. Well, I suppose he is in some ways, but he also has quite strong neoliberal inclinations, which I've just argued is not conservative, so I'm kind of not in a position to say he's conservative on that score. When he comes up with a scheme like this maternity leave scheme, people say, well, how's that conservative? Well, it's very conservative. It's family values and all that sort of stuff.
But in its economic basis, it's a sort of almost Whitlamist kind
of
idea, isn't it?
It's intervention in the economy, but that's not unconservative. Could be very conservative. I mean, the conservative, I would argue, should be quite prepared to intervene in the economy in order to maintain the structures of society. That his climate change response is fascinating. I don't really know what to make of it. It's neoliberal in the sense that business as usual will not be punished. So go on emitting the way you are. You can even emit more provided you're more productive.
Because it's based on intensity, not straight
It's
emissions.
emissions intensity, which is basically how much you emit per unit of GDP, rather than emissions. So as long as you emit more and more, but you do it at a rate that is commensurate with your growth, that's fine.
And then you might be punished, but we can't say how much you'll be punished if you move beyond.
And if you go beyond it, then
fined
if you go beyond it, something will happen. Not sure exactly what, but that says that it's neoliberal in the sense that the market should be left to operate, and if it operates as it's currently operating, we're not going to touch it. But then, if you do want to undertake some project to cut your emissions, you apply to a fund where you'll get funding to do that. And who makes the decision about what funding you're going to get? Well, presumably the government, which is not only not neoliberal, it's centrally planned economy. That's the government deciding what should and should not get funding on the basis of what will and will not cut emissions. So when this came out, I spent days trying to figure out what this policy was, philosophically. Now, there wasn't actually a lot of conversation about that in our public discourse, because coming back to the point, I don't think we're that interested in ideas. Well, I think people are, but I don't think the public discourse is. It doesn't give it to them, at least. So I don't know how to assess Abbott yet, and partly he's an opposition leader. That's how to assess him. He opposes. And the Rudd government, I think one of its abiding crises will be the fact that it is not ideologically clear. Kevin Rudd has enormous support in the polls. His approval rating is astronomical. Fell away very quickly. And my reading of that, and I could be wrong, but my reading of that is that support was broad but not very deep. People were willing to approve, but they were very quick not to approve once something changed. And I think the reason that approval was fragile is because there isn't a clear idea. It might be there somewhere, and I just haven't detected it, but I don't think the electorate's detected it.
Well, Kevin Rudd may have actually explained it, but you didn't understand it.
That's possibly
isn't that
true.
Quite a possibility.
But Kevin Rudd's experience is interesting, because I think it's also a symptom of this post-ideological politics that he seemed to talk about. We're going to get beyond the left-right thing. Tony Blair did it. Kevin Rudd did it. Barack Obama's trying it. It's not working. So now you've got Barack Obama doing, he's passed his healthcare today. It's the end of bipartisanship now. He's basically, I'm doing this, and not one Republican vote.
Yes, that's an amazing moment in American political history that every Republican has voted against it. So,
which makes sense. That happens here.
Yes,
a lot.
indeed.
But in America, that's rare.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think part of one of the consequences of trying to transcend the ideological divides in politics is that you may end up not actually having a clear idea that animates your politics. And that might be something that Kevin Rudd's suffering from. I also think what doesn't help in this situation is the nature of the media cycle now. The 24-hour media cycle means that governing becomes essentially media management in a lot of cases. And it's about how you deal with the 24-hour media cycle.
I'd suggest to you it's actually not 24 hours anymore. I think it might have been 5 or 6 years ago. I suspect that news cycles are 3 or 4 hours at a time, almost. You might get an overarching story that runs through, but it's about managing the morning and the afternoon and possibly the evening.
That's right.
When the story's really running.
So one of my favourite lines from an obscure place: "The past becomes itself more quickly." Yeah. That's what's happening.
Absolutely.
And so you're right. So what that means is short attention spans, little blobs of information, lots of announceables. It's very important to have announceables. But ideas, that's a much longer conversation. We don't do fireside chats, really, in our politics. And then when Kevin Rudd writes a 6,000-word essay, people ridicule him. He's a prime minister, not an academic. Why is he writing an essay? Well,
But if you look at, the Liberal Party and the kind of mishmash of different philosophical positions that generate some of, Tony Abbott's positions, Isn't that really in keeping with a kind of an historical pattern that goes back to Menzies or before? You know, the fusion parties, say, back in the 100 years ago. We did have a kind of mixed economy in that, especially in the post-war period, where Labor would announce a policy and Menzies would pick it up and then keep going and look after his base and all the rest of it.
The game playing of politics always means you're not going to get pristine applications of ideas. I mean, the world is not a laboratory, and it doesn't work that way. And then there's political compromises that are reached in order to get anything done. I understand that. And the Liberal Party, I guess, has always been one of those things that is tricky because it is built onto political traditions that have sort of become married, but initially were sworn enemies. And that is conservatism and liberalism. Now, liberalism, which I didn't talk about, I should, it's reasonably important. Liberalism is ultimately the idea that the individual is the unit of society that should be protected. So that rather than the government expresses the will of the people, the role of the state and of our institutions is to preserve the liberty of the individual from the tyranny of the majority. And that's an idea that animates our entire structure. We have a balance of powers because of this idea that the state should have a limited role in how much power it can have over people. We have things like freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, if not constitutionally guaranteed, then at least largely in our psyche. That derives from liberalism. Conservatism and liberalism were originally sworn enemies, then socialism came along and they said, hey, you know what, let's get together. So they did. And so you have a liberal conservative tradition. And at times they pull in opposite directions and you get that sort of distinction. But I think there is something different about that tension being played out in, say, Menzies' time and the way that it plays out now. And that is that within liberalism, there is still the notion of, a quite powerful notion of society, of shared culture, of shared values, and so on and so forth, as that kind of being the glue that helps the individual liberty thing function. And so conservatives could easily embrace that. But neoliberalism is, I guess, a form of liberalism that's slightly more extreme. And in that extremity, it starts to erode that glue, that social glue. And that's where the distinctions, I think, become starker. And if you want to see how this is played out in the current Liberal Party, you need only look at Tony Abbott, because he's got two heroes, Bob Santamaria, John Howard. Very, very different people. Very, very different views on a lot of things. Bob Santamaria, fierce critic of capitalism, very conservative. Couldn't stand capitalism, probably for that reason. Didn't like the social destruction of it, thought that it compromised values, and was worried about the social inequities that it would unleash and what that might mean. John Howard, fiercely pro-capitalist, work choices being the ultimate expression of that. Pulling in really quite extremely opposite directions, and straddling them somehow for the moment is Tony Abbott. And I guess we'll see what happens.
Indeed.
It's going to be interesting. There's no doubt it'll be interesting. And he said he would be interesting. And he's definitely kept that promise.
We might take some questions now, if you like. Are you okay with that? Over there, just near the aisle.
I was just wondering what role technology is playing in this, in the ability of conservatism to do things slowly. Given that the information revolution and the incredible growth of China as two examples.
Yeah, well, I think, don't stop at technology. Let's just say globalisation. Globalisation is a really quite radically transformative force. And this is why I come back to the comment I made earlier. I'm not exactly sure how you'd be conservative in the classical sense in that environment. The fact is that social changes largely ushered in on the watch of conservative politicians, and often with support, have changed the world so irrevocably and so quickly that conservatism becomes a very difficult thing to sustain. But I would say this, conservatism is meant to be pragmatic. That's one of the things that distinguishes it from progressive politics. Progressive politics is idealistic. It says, this is the way the world should look and let's go out and make it that way. That's what a progressive is. I don't mean that as a term of endearment, I mean it just as a technical term. A conservative is usually a pragmatist. And what that means is that I think at the very least what a conservative response should do, even in a radically changing environment like the one we confront, is recognise the inevitability of that. And then just try to figure out ways to manage it. Now, that sounds like a really broad principle with no content, but it does have content when you come to think about, for example, the comments I made earlier about neoconservatism, where the response, you run record levels of immigration because it's good for the economy, and then you lecture people who come on what their values should be, as though that's going to work. As though people could just be told what their values are going to be. Oh, okay. Thanks for the heads up. Now I'll accept these values. No, I mean, a conservative should at the very least understand that these are the natural consequences of this set of circumstances. And rather than pretend it's some other way or have a reactionary nostalgic response that tries to establish an old order that's gone, let's work with what we have. If that means we need, for example, with the technology, the impact that has on the way that people can think about themselves, the way that their identities can change because they're able to communicate with people all over the world and all this sort of stuff. If that's the way it's going to be, then let's talk about a national identity that is able to sustain that level of diversity. That to me would be a more conservative response because at least it's pragmatic and realistic. I don't think it's a conservative response to say, right, here are your values. When you do that, you end up with the comment, one of my favourite comments from Brendan Nelson. He gave the Simpson and his donkey thing. It was just, what a wonderful moment in Australian politics that was. And he said, amazing quote, we don't care where you've come from or what you believe, but when you come to Australia, we expect you to accept these values. I don't care what you believe, as long as it's this. That to me is the contradiction inheres in the fact that it's an unconservative response to the predicaments of modernity.
We do have time for just one more, sir. Do you just want to wait for the mic?
I'm interested how extremism fits into all of this, like, be it assassins with stolen identities, or be it aeroplanes in the buildings, or anti-immigration neo-fascist movements in Europe. Where does this extremism fit into these theories that you've talked about?
Well, that's a really good question. I teach a course on this at Monash if you'd like to enrol. Sorry, I was being neoliberal for a moment. Right. We live in an extreme age. And we live in an extreme age because it's a world that is so rapidly changing. The only thing that's constant about it is that flux. We live in a world of radical pluralism. You cannot sustain homogeneity anymore. You just can't. You can try. Even if you're China, you can try. But this box springs leaks and things pop out. People have access to ideas that they wouldn't have been able to access in a pre-modern age. And for many people, that's really wonderfully invigorating and so on and so forth. And it is. But it's also very disruptive. The thing about rapid change is it changes your environment. And it calls into question so many of the assumptions and the axioms on which your life was built. And when that happens, when you're in an environment of such radical change, your response is to try to mitigate that. in some way. And one of the easiest ways to do that, and one of the most popular, it seems, in our world, is in the realm of identity and culture. This change is really radical. The industry that has sustained this town no longer exists there. It's not just an economic problem, it's an identity issue. The construction of the society is different now. It's a reactionary recreation of the past that these people are engaged in. Every religious fundamentalist movement, no matter how historical it sounds, is not historical. It's radically modern. It constructs an imagined past that is glorious. It constructs an imagined history of ideas. And it does that because that is a much better way of latching on to something that is meaningful. Amongst all this change, I know that I am still a Hindu and that this land belongs to us. And so you get the Hindutva movement. When did that arise? After partition. Radical change in the political structures of society. Vulnerability. How do you respond to that? Reassert some other kind of certainty. It is no coincidence, in my view, that the rise of what we call the far right, although I can't say that anymore because I've just said I don't know what that means, but the rise of ultra-nationalist parties across Europe occurred through the 90s and the early part of the 2000s, just when this change was probably at its most radical. And these are not insignificant parties now. White supremacist parties, sometimes just ultra-nationalist parties. Some of them are forming governing coalitions in places like Denmark. Our own One Nation emerged in the mid-90s. In response to what? Our integration into Asia, the changing of Australian identity to an Asian identity, the Republican movement, Paul Keating saying we want to change the flag. And then you get this response. That to me is just a natural consequence of our time. It's not, humans are not becoming, degenerating into this. This is just one of the responses of modernity, which is why I think it's actually a very good argument for the conservative position that radical change is to be avoided, because it throws up things like this that you can't. Now, that's futile to say now, but that's my diagnosis of it.
Thanks, Waleed. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something. And if you don't have a copy of the quarterly essay, I'm not getting a cut, but I do recommend you either buy one or steal one. So thanks for coming and good night.
What's up?